The video is obviously taken from someone's phone. At first, all we see is a suitcase lying on a living room floor. But then the bag begins to move. Something is alive inside. Then the voice of a man is heard crying in desperation to be let loose. He is struggling to breathe, desperately calling out the name Sarah. Finally, a female voice. She sounds intoxicated. She is laughing, taunting. For everything you've done to me, that's on you. That's what I feel like when you cheat on me. Please join me for this special episode of Courtroom Confidential, 5 Things You Need to Know, the case of Sarah Boone. If you're an avid follower of true crime, you've probably heard about Sarah Boone before. She's been in the news quite a bit, mainly for her antics in court and how many attorneys she's gone through. She's on to number 9 now. But her trial is set to begin this October 7th. And one of the things that we try to do on this channel is give you a little bit of the background and understanding of what to expect on a case before we head into trial. So please join me for this episode of 5 Things You Need to Know, the case of Sarah Boone. Let's jump right in. First, number 1, what happened? On February 25th, 2020 in Winter Park, Florida, just outside of Orlando, Sarah Boone is 42 years old at the time, and she calls 911. When first responders arrive at the home, what they find is something very disturbing. George Torres Jr., he's also 42 years old. He is lifeless, laying on the floor next to a blue suitcase. They describe in the report that he has a small laceration on his lip and what appeared to be some bruising around his eye. They decide to take Sarah back to the station to have an interview with her. She's already given some statements at the scene according to badge cam videos. But here at the station, detectives decide to interview her and ask what happened the night before, and she willingly gives them a statement. She said that they were having a drinking game. George and Sarah had been dating for some time, and they decided that it might be fun to play hide and seek. And this is what's important. George, according to Sarah, gets into the suitcase voluntarily. And that makes sense. It would seem difficult for her to overpower him and zip him up inside of the suitcase. Boone tells the detectives, "I zipped him up. We thought it would be funny." Sarah then says she went upstairs and passed out. Now, according to her, she has no recollection of anything else that happened that evening, and she woke up very late the next day, around 1 p.m. She says that at this point she realized that Torres may still be inside of the bag, and she rushes downstairs, opens up the bag, and finds him unresponsive and not breathing. She does something bizarre next. She decides to call her ex-husband who lives close by. That's her first phone call. He tells her, "Call the police immediately." Investigators then ask Sarah if they can search her phone, and she says sure. Again, she has no recollection of anything that took place, according to her, from the time that he got inside the suitcase till she woke up the next day. What detectives find on her phone are 2 different videos that were taken by Sarah. One interesting thing is that there does not appear to be any attempt by Sarah to delete these videos, which, as we're going to find, given the nature of these videos, would seem to corroborate her statements that she has no recollection of what took place that evening. In the first video, we see the suitcase, and we hear Torres begging to be let out. He's saying, "Sarah, I can't breathe," constantly repeating her name. And then we hear Sarah's voice. She's holding the phone. She sounds intoxicated, and she's taunting him. She's saying, "Yeah, that's what you do when you choke me. That's on you. Oh, that's what I feel like when you cheat on me. You should probably shut the F up." Torres is struggling, or as much as he can, I guess, inside of the suitcase. Then there's a second video. And what's immediately noticeable about this video is that the suitcase has been moved. It's in a different location on the floor, still inside the living room, but it also appears as though the suitcase has been flipped over. Now, there doesn't seem to be any way that Torres could have done that himself, given his limited movement inside of that suitcase. One can only conclude that Sarah was the one who actually flipped the suitcase over. Again, you hear her laughing, constantly telling him to shut up. She's saying, "That's for everything you've done to me. F you." Again, in both videos, Sarah's voice sounds very intoxicated. According to the medical examiner, Torres died of what they call positional asphyxia with environmental suffocation consistent with prolonged confinement. I'll translate that for you. It means he suffocated to death because he was trapped inside of a suitcase and couldn't move. According to the medical examiner, it is believed that he was inside of that suitcase for 11 hours. Also notable was that his back, hands, eyes, and head had abrasions and contusions consistent to what the report calls blunt impact around the body, presenting the question of whether or not, while inside the bag, he was beaten. Later that same day, Sarah is arrested and charged with second-degree murder. Number 2, a history of domestic violence. We now know that Boone and Torres started dating sometime in 2017 and they quickly moved in together. We don't know much about their backgrounds, but it is believed that Torres is from Philadelphia and Boone was from Orlando. And trouble, it seems like, immediately begins. And this is where we start to see this cycle of violence that we have become all too familiar with in domestic violence cases. There are several reports, and this, we can only imagine, might just be the tip of the iceberg of the violence that was taking place inside of that home. In 2018, Boone herself is charged with battery and, interestingly, strangulation. According to Boone, she was dragged upstairs by Torres, kicked in the eye, and this was all because she had been talking to another man at a bar where Torres and Boone were at earlier that evening. Apparently, she had asked the other man for a cigarette, and this set Torres off. According to Torres, she was strangling him, and he kicked her in self-defense. Now, as we see all too often in these types of cases, the police simply cannot determine who is at fault. Both sides are pointing fingers at each other. There's no corroborating evidence to either side. There's no eyewitnesses independent to either one of them. And neither one of them want to press charges, and the case is simply dropped. Then again, in 2019, Torres is arrested this time. Again, there's allegations of cheating, perhaps allegations of alcohol or drug use. And according to Boone, during this beating, Torres threatens her, "You're going to die." Now, in this case, Boone actually testified in court, and it actually led to a domestic violence conviction for which Torres was put on probation. Later that same year, Torres violates probation for allegedly punching Boone on the head. This is why domestic violence cases are so difficult. When I was a prosecutor, they were some of the more difficult cases you would ever have to prove in court. And many times, more times than not, the victim would not be cooperative. She would ask to drop the charges. She would say that she wanted no part of the prosecution. This frustrates the police, it frustrates the district attorneys involved, and it leads to what we call a cycle of violence. People get back together, they try to make up, the violence occurs again, the drinking, the drugs, and again until it leads to some tragedy like we're discussing here today. Number 3, what do we know about Sarah Boone? Well, put quite simply, she is difficult. As you all may know, she is now on to her 9th attorney. All of these attorneys were court appointed except for her last attorney that we'll get to later. Many of these attorneys said that they had to withdraw for conflicts of interest, but the ones that were willing to put statements on the record, I think, paint a very different picture. Let's talk about some of those. First, Frank Bankowitz. He was her 6th attorney. He told the court that Boone would try to call him at least 5 to 10 times a day, and it almost became impossible for him to try to manage his other clients. According to him, Boone will not be satisfied with any attorney unless said attorney does not have a caseload and can dedicate his or her time solely to Ms. Boone's case. Boone's response to that in court was to call him a dud and a buffoon. Right after him was Winston Hobson, her 7th attorney. He described her simply as unreasonable and difficult to work with. Then the court appointed Patricia Cashman. This was now attorney number 8. According to the court, she was described as widely known to be able to handle and willing to deal with and manage difficult clients. As we can see, that did not work out well. According to Cashman, she said, "I've spent over 20 hours going through her questions, going through her lists. When I tried to update her with regard to the depositions that I took recently, she opted to exit the jail conference room. When I tried to review some things with regard to discovery as to things I wanted to make sure she was aware of, she walked out." Boone's response to the court, "I want to make it known I walked out on my attorney in our last meeting due to her unwarranted, uninformative, unprofessional, snotty attitude." It wasn't just her attorneys who were having problems with Boone. Also the guards where she's being held. This is according to inmate behavior notes. On one occasion when a lawyer tried to visit her, according to the report, inmate Boone stated that she does not feel comfortable visiting anyone that she doesn't know because, quote, "crazy people have been reaching out and scheduling visits with her claiming to be someone they are not." When the staff told her who the attorney was, unfortunately the attorney left because of the delay in response about whether or not she would be able to meet with him. When Boone learned of this, she, quote, "became upset." In another incident, she declined to use 3 USB drives and a hard drive because she needed a, quote, "mental break." Boone has also been very particular about her clothing and makeup in court, especially when it comes to how she will present during trial. According to jail staff, they discovered that she had altered the pants and the seam of her uniform with staples. According to the report, during a search, inmate Boone became argumentative and questioning staff why her property was being searched. I explained to inmate Boone that she is subject to search at any time. The inmate was not receptive. While Boone's hands will remain uncuffed, she will be placed in a stun cuff during the jury trial. Despite this, she still wants to wear a skirt in court during trial, over warnings from the judge that this will likely make the stun cuff visible to the jury because it will be worn on her leg. This stun cuff, by the way, can discharge 50,000 volts, which would cause her to fall to the floor instantly if she were to misbehave. And she has also been granted that while trial is going on, she will be dressed in street clothes and for her to allow her makeup and hair to be done for trial. One more note that I think gives us an insight into Boone's character was after her 8th attorney was withdrawn, the court temporarily forced Boone to represent herself, essentially. And Boone was not happy with this. She actually made an ad. You may have seen this online. She titles the ad, "Inmate Seeks Attorney." Inmate and attorney are emphasized in bold-like writing. It goes on to say, "Looking for a prosperous challenge? Ready for your close-up on national television? Are you zealous with a side of keen?" Boone says, "Show the world who you are with your original creativity, extraordinary expertise, and confident ingenuity." Number 4, a mess of legal issues. As we mentioned before, Boone was at one point denied a court-appointed attorney. Judge Michael Cranick said at the time, who's the one presiding over the case, that Boone had forfeited her right to legal counsel after she had gone through, by the way, 8 lawyers. She also was denied standby counsel. Speaking about this, Judge Cranick said, "As the court has determined that you have forfeited and alternatively waived by your conduct your right to court-appointed counsel, the court is not required to appoint standby counsel." Boone fired back, as she always does, to the court, "I do not forfeit my right. That was your judgment. And also, I feel that I should have some kind of evidentiary hearing prior to your decision so that I could have a better chance at explaining myself and your understanding. I don't want to be pro se any longer. I didn't want to be pro se in the first place." In response, Judge Cranick simply said, "Denied, period." Now, this is interesting to talk about, and while the issue may not be as important now that she has another attorney, it was a very interesting point in the proceedings leading up to her trial because we're talking about a Sixth Amendment right to have counsel. The Sixth Amendment includes many things. It includes a right to a speedy trial, a right to an impartial jury, and according to the Constitution, to have the assistance of counsel for defense. And in situations where a person can't afford an attorney, we've all heard this, the court will appoint an attorney for you. This is why we have things like the Public Defender's Office and appointed counsel in different jurisdictions. But you can forfeit your right by your own conduct. In this case, she had satisfied all the elements of having forfeited that. She had been warned. Her conduct had been a problem. In other words, you do not have an unlimited and frivolous use of public resources, and that's what the court had determined here. Now, that doesn't mean that she's not allowed to have a lawyer. It just means that a lawyer won't be paid for her by the taxpayers. And as we can see, she actually does have a lawyer now, her 9th lawyer. Which brings us to number 5, what to expect at trial. Attorney James Owens, who is now representing Boone as her 9th lawyer, told reporters that he saw Boone's self-drawn advertisement seeking representation and eventually sent her a letter, and that's how the two were able to connect. Now, recently at a hearing, it was discussed what her defense would actually be. Many times when an attorney is presenting their case to a judge, the judge has to know what the defense might be in order to know what evidence to allow in. In this case, there was a discussion about battered spouse syndrome and self-defense. Recently, Owens told Judge Cranick, "Judge, for the record, we are claiming self-defense. We are utilizing the battered spouse syndrome in conjunction with that defense, not accident as they want to allege," speaking about the prosecution. And what is funny is the judge was actually surprised by this. He paused for a moment and then confirmed, "Are you claiming self-defense? Well, that's the first time I've heard that." Well, the prosecution had something to say about this. First, they filed a motion asking the judge to strike any use of battered spouse syndrome. They pointed towards an interview that Boone gave with Orange County Sheriff's Office investigators, where she was asked, "What was your motivation for leaving him in the bag?" Her response, "I didn't have any motivation. It was me, he and I having a great day, fooling around and being stupid, and apparently me going upstairs and going, I'm guessing, I don't, I'm blaming it on the wine." Prosecutors then added that they were aware that there was a history of domestic violence between Boone and Torres, and that it was usually fueled by alcohol, adding, "That does not make a battered spouse syndrome defense." Judge Cranick has said that he will allow the defense to use battered spouse syndrome in their opening statements, but he is requiring that Boone submit to an examination by an expert of the state's choosing in time for the trial to still proceed on October 7th. This gives us an opportunity to talk about what battered spouse syndrome is, how it works as the defense, and how it can work, according to this attorney, in conjunction with self-defense. Battered spouse syndrome essentially is part of the overall idea of self-defense. In other words, it's saying that because of this cycle of abuse, someone felt that they were in a position where they could do nothing else but cause the other person harm in order to save their life. Self-defense always deals with the premise of reasonableness. Was the threat reasonable enough to respond with a reasonable response? If someone was threatening your life and that was reasonable, that you believed that your life was in danger, did you respond in a reasonable way, which may even include taking the other person's life? Battered spouse syndrome takes that immediacy and extends it. It says that because of this overall environment of violence, that the threat of violence did not have to be immediate at that time. And that extends the idea of what we might even feel as reasonable. Now, the argument that Boone's attorney, I'm guessing, intends to make here, and I'm not saying I agree with it, but intends to make here, is that because she was in such fear, because of this violence that we do know about, she felt that she could not let him out of that suitcase, because if she did, he would kill her. And therefore, she simply left him in. The prosecution is saying, however, when presented with an opportunity to actually explain that, she didn't, and instead, she blamed it on alcohol. Which brings us to the prosecution's theory, which is essentially the idea of what we call depraved heart murder, where a person acts with such depraved indifference to human life and their conduct results in death, despite that person not explicitly, maybe even intending to kill that other person. In other words, you can substitute the malice required in a murder case for this depraved heart. They're saying that in this situation, she was so indifferent to his safety, begging for his life, begging to be left out, telling her that he can't breathe. And instead, she's responding by laughing and telling him it's his own fault, that depraved indifference can be substituted for the malice required for a murder case. This case is fascinating. It's a simple case, factually. There are not a lot of moving parts. We understand what took place. She admits to much of what took place, and we know how this person died. But it's an incredibly difficult case from a legal perspective, and we're dealing with a very difficult and interesting defendant. As I said, trial will begin on October 7th. So please join us as we continue to cover this case. But in the meantime, thank you so much for joining me for this very special episode of 5 Things You Need to Know from Courtroom Confidential. Have a great week, and I will see you again this Friday.